thank you for coming to my talk. I know it's very hard in the middle of the semester to find time to come to one of these, so I really appreciate it. What I'll be reading today is work that is already in press, and so I can't change it. But I'm still interested in what people think, because the issue of Romanticism as social class is something I'll always be thinking about. So it's not as if it's a dead issue. So what I'll start with is I'll read part of the review that will appear in Wordsworth Circle, and it's a review of two books. Aruna Krishnamurti edited this volume, The Working Class Intellectual in 18th and 19th Century Britain. And the second book reviewed is Andrew Murphy, Shakespeare and the People, Working Class Readers, 1800 and 1900. And I'll read the last 2 pages of the review. And then I'll read more or less most of the essay Romanticism and Class, which will appear in Handbook to Romanticism Studies. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so this is the last 2 pages of the review. Krishnamurti's article, chapter, Coffee House versus Ale House, Notes on the Making of 18th Century Working Class Intellectual, positions John Thelwall in terms of 2 iconic sites of working class sociability. Drawing upon the work of Ian McCalman on unrespectable radicalism, Krishnamurti contrasts the pre-industrial tradition of the revolutionary crowd with the emergent tradition of rationalistic self-improvement, reform, and industrial discipline. Thelwall, like the London Corresponding Society he represents, participates in both cultures, but finally belongs mostly to the rationalistic bourgeois set of assumptions. Thelwall's treatment of the gypsies in his work, The Peripatetic, illustrates his affinity for the orderly worker over the anarchistic lumpen proletariat. One thing Krishnamurti neglects to mention in this context is that Marx himself had little sympathy for the lumpen proletariat, or the peasantry, Marx characterized the peasantry with its rural idiocy, and a clear preference for the orderly, self-improving industrial working class. One of the best essays in the book, William J. Christmas's From Threshing Corn, He Turns to Thresh His Brains, Stephen Duck as Laboring Class Intellectual, defends through close readings Duck's turning away from representing working class life and turning instead to adaptations of Horace's odes. And Duck wrote 3 Horatian odes. Counter to a line of criticism from E.P. Thompson to Raymond Williams, both Marxist critics, that Duck betrayed his authenticity as a writer when he stopped writing about his farming life, as he had done in The Thresher's Labor, Christmas describes sympathetically Duck's poetic model as the, quote, the learned didactic arbiter of social values. Challenging the category of authenticity, Christmas points out Duck's authentic desire to succeed in the professional role of poet as it existed in the 18th century. Moreover, to take advantage of the full expressive range of poetry at that time, it was necessary to appropriate classical genres and conventions. Christmas's close readings of 3 Horatian odes illustrates Duck's personal intellectual development and technical skill as a poet. Additionally, Duck was implicitly arguing for the laboring class poet's right to a life of the mind and the public role of the poet. Duck's success as poet and Anglican cleric contrasts with the lachrymose history of Duck as the deracinated suicide and class traitor. Although Duck clearly does not resemble the Gramscian counter-hegemonic intellectual producer of, quote, overtly politicized class-conscious discourse of communitarian radicalism, Christmas argues interestingly and persuasively that Duck is nevertheless an unacknowledged prototype of the English working class intellectual because of sanctioning the intellectual and social transformation of a one-time agricultural wage laborer. If the aesthetic medium were music or painting, would it make sense to demand of the laboring class artist an authenticity that would exclude him or her from the complete repertoire of expressive techniques? And then I'll turn to the final paragraph, which makes reference to especially the Shakespeare book. Despite the radical framing of the collection's essays by Krishnamurti, many of the chapters, notably Christmases and Sense, escape the distracting conceptual categories of the revolutionary tradition of class interpretation. Murphy's Shakespeare for the People, building from Jonathan Rose's pioneering intellectual life of the British working classes, uses the 19th century autobiographies by workers, men and women, to describe the appropriation of Shakespeare. By mid-century, Shakespeare's complete works could be purchased for 1 shilling, and individual plays at a halfpenny each. John Dick's 1 shilling complete works of Shakespeare sold 1 million copies in 2 years. Shakespeare, of course, was popular in theaters, where workers enjoyed the plays, but during the period of Chartism and later working class struggles, Shakespeare became, quote, a card-carrying member of the working class. The decline of the bard's popularity came only with the institutionalization of Shakespeare in the schools after the Forced Education Act of 1870. But if one considers the numerous film versions, it is apparent Shakespeare still had and has appeal after he became an examination topic. But is Shakespeare good for the revolution? It depends. Quote, for the Chartists and for the first generation of labor politicians, Shakespeare was a genuine ally, whose words were made to serve progressive political ends. Did labor really need Shakespeare, however? Probably not. But he was too good to let the upper classes claim for their own. Okay. Now I'll turn to essay that will appear in Handbook to Romanticism Studies. It's published by Blackwell and edited by Julia Wright and Joel Fefleck. And I'm going to skip one section on class, language, and genre, but I'll read the rest of it. Class enters the discourse of Romanticism in 3 different ways. The first is in romantic poetics, either Austen's defense of women novelists in Northanger Abbey, or Blake's condemnation of aristocratic culture in favor of plebeian Bible reading, or the bold manifesto in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which announces that the language of the middle and lower classes can represent incidents and situations from common life for the highest kind of poetry. The most philosophical poetry depicts carefully low and rustic life because rural existence is closer to the eternal truths poetry aims to grasp. The Romantic critique of Augustan literary norms was conducted under the sign of class, a broadly anti-aristocratic cultural offensive. A second way class becomes meaningful is by attending to the class position of the authors themselves, a social awareness displayed at the time in relation to peasant poets, as they were called, like Robert Burns and John Clare, and aristocrats, like Lord Byron, and exercised much later by sociologically oriented critics like Raymond Williams. A third site where class meets Romanticism is ideology, the question of how the literary texts function in relation to the structure of power. Ideology has not been something of just recent interest, for the prominent critic Francis Jeffrey zealously patrolled the cultural norms in the Edinburgh Review against all incursions from what looked like democracy. The critical concepts of romantic anti-capitalism and romantic individualism are especially pertinent in relation to the category of class. Of course, class has been part of the critical toolkit at least since the 1980s, when the categories of race, class, and gender became principal areas that had been earlier excluded, but now were supposed to be inserted in literary studies.